In the shadow of loss, a reclusive man unexpectedly discovers a glimmer of light through the loyalty of a German shepherd. More than just a companion, the dog becomes a bridge guiding a fragile young girl back toward the world she fears. Each step, each gentle touch of warm fur unfolds a journey of healing and quiet resilience. But as the invisible wall of fear slowly crumbles, what awaits them on the other side? The wind drifted through the pines behind the old cabin, rattling the roof as if reminding the house it still stood on borrowed time. Shadows swayed against the wooden walls, bending and folding like restless ghosts. Daniel sat in his worn armchair, a cooling cup of black tea in his hands, staring at the fire that cracked and spat in the hearth. The flames were never simply flames to him. They were memory. Every flicker called back the ambulance lights, the rain-slick road, and the weight of helplessness that had rooted itself in his chest the night he lost everything. This cabin was not home. It was refuge, exile, and a cage built from grief. On the rug near the window stretched Shadow. His coat was warm amber, brushed with sable across his back, glowing like liquid honey in the trembling light. Upright ears caught every creak, every sigh of the house. His chest rose slow and steady, the rhythm of his breath an anchor in Daniel's nights. From the first day Shadow had padded across the threshold, the man had felt less like he was drowning. The dog had a way of being present, without demanding, of reminding him that solitude did not have to mean emptiness. Sometimes when Daniel woke gasping from dreams of twisted steel, Shadow's head would already be resting against his arm, eyes steady and unafraid, as if to say, "I'll keep watch until you breathe again." The cabin itself was a map of survival. Every scuff in the floorboards, every faded patch of paint, every nail that stuck just slightly out of line, told the story of years Daniel had forced himself to endure. Yet there was one wall, an old stretch of pine in the living room, that he avoided looking at for too long. Its paint had yellowed, its surface cracked. To Daniel, it was more than wood and nails. It was a mirror of the barrier inside him, the wall he had built to keep people at a distance, to keep memories in check, to keep himself from facing the hollow ache that had defined him since the accident. The clock ticked past 11 when Shadow stirred. His head snapped up, ears, pricked muscles braced. Daniel froze, cup hovering mid-air. "Shadow," he called softly. The dog didn't glance at him. Instead, he rose silent and taut and padded toward the old wall. He pressed his muzzle close, sniffing, then raked his claws against the wood. The sound cut through the house, sharp, urgent, insistent. Daniel set his cup down, his chest tightening. "What is it?" he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. He had seen Shadow paw at walls before, when mice nested, when a draft carried scents of damp earth. But this was different. There was urgency in the way the dog's tail stiffened, in the rhythm of his scratches, in the quick, low whines squeezed from his chest. It was as though every instinct in him demanded attention, demanded action. "Easy boy," Daniel said, though his own pulse betrayed the calmness of his voice. He pressed his palm to the cold wood, half to reassure Shadow, half to remind himself it was only a wall. The chill seeped into his skin. He leaned closer, closing his eyes to listen. At first there was only the pop of fire, the steady heartbeat of the clock, the sigh of wind slipping under the eaves. He nearly convinced himself it was nothing. Nearly. Then came something else. Faint. So faint he thought it must be imagination. A quiver of sound, thin as a thread of air. Not the groan of timber, not the whistle of wind. Something that trembled, faltered, and returned again, muffled, but undeniably human. A breath. A sob. Daniel staggered back, breath catching in his throat. "No," he whispered. His mind clawed for explanation, pipes, shifting wood, contracting, but Shadow's sudden bark shattered his denial. The dog pressed forward, paws, scraping as if to tear down the wall himself. Amber eyes fixed on Daniel with desperate certainty. For a long moment, Daniel stood frozen, the weight of choice pressing heavy. He had built walls around himself for years, burying grief beneath layers of silence. Now the wall before him, this literal wall, seemed alive, demanding he face what lay hidden not only within the house, but within himself. "All right," he murmured, voice low, trembling. He went to the utility closet and pulled down the toolbox, its metal cold and familiar in his grip. Tools were safety. Tools meant control. Hammer, crowbar, flashlight, all lined as neatly as he kept them, the only order in his otherwise fractured life. When he returned, Shadow stepped aside just enough to let him through, tail beating a nervous rhythm against the floor. Daniel positioned the crowbar between two planks, hand steady, though his pulse thundered. He hesitated, pressing his ear once more to the wood. The sound came again, clearer now. A ragged breath. A whimper. The unmistakable cry of a child who had run out of strength to scream. His knees weakened. The crowbar nearly slipped from his hand. He saw flames. He saw twisted metal. He saw his daughter's face, memory colliding with reality, until he nearly collapsed beneath the weight of it. Shadow nudged his leg sharply, grounding him back into the moment. Daniel drew in a ragged breath. "Okay," he whispered. "We do this together." The crowbar bit into the seam of the wall. With a sharp crack, the plank shifted. Dust burst out, glittering in the beam of the flashlight. He pried again, wood splintering under his weight. Each sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the house, each creak an echo of resistance. Finally, a gap opened, dark and narrow, like the mouth of a secret. He lifted the flashlight and aimed its beam inside. The light caught Webb's old bricks, the rough edge of timber. And then movement. A shiver, slight but undeniable. Daniel leaned closer, heart in his throat. Pressed into the hollow, small knees drawn tight against her chest, tangled hair hiding her face, was a girl. For a moment, Daniel thought his mind had betrayed him, had conjured a vision out of grief and longing. But then, she flinched at the light, her breath catching audibly in the tiny space. She was real. So impossibly real. Shadow whined, low tail sweeping the floor as he inched forward, muzzle reaching through the gap. The girl's fingers twitched, hesitant, before brushing the fur that touched her. And in that instant, something cracked, not just in the wall, not just in the house, but in Daniel. The wall he had built inside himself shuddered. He lowered the flashlight, voice breaking, as he whispered, "It's okay. You're safe now." The last plank groaned as Daniel pulled it free, and the hole yawned wide enough to reveal what until moments ago he would have called impossible. Dust spiraled in the beam of his flashlight, drifting around a fragile silhouette curled tightly into itself. At first he thought it was some trick of shadow and wood. A bundle of forgotten rags, perhaps, or insulation clumped into a shape the mind might mistake for human. But then the bundle shifted, trembled, drew a jagged breath. Tangled strands of hair caught the light. Thin shoulders shook. Daniel's pulse hammered in his throat. "Oh, God," he whispered. The girl pressed herself further into the hollow as if she could vanish into the timber itself. She was small, 7, maybe 8, and so thin she seemed scarcely more than bones wrapped in fabric. Her knees clutched to her chest, arms locked tight around them. Every movement spoke of fear carved too deep for words. Shadow whined softly and crept closer, tail swishing low. He pressed his muzzle through the gap, careful, gentle, as though he knew that any sudden motion might shatter what little trust lingered in the dim space. The girl flinched, hiding her face against her knees. But her trembling slowed when Shadow's breath brushed against her skin, warm and steady. The sound of his gentle whimper filled the silence like a promise. Daniel crouched, tools forgotten at his side. "Hey," he said, voice rough, halting as though the air had thickened around him. "It's okay. You're safe." The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He hadn't spoken them aloud in years, not since he'd failed to keep anyone safe the night his world collapsed. Yet somehow they left his lips again, directed not at ghosts this time, but at this living child hidden in his wall. Her eyes flickered up, two pale blue shards wide with terror. They locked on him for a heartbeat before darting away. Daniel set the flashlight on the floor so its beam cast a soft, indirect glow. He lifted both hands, slowly, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you." His voice cracked despite his effort to steady it. "You don't have to be afraid." The girl shook her head violently. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged, only a whisper of breath, too faint to shape into words. She buried her face again, as if retreating into a world where silence was safer than speech. Daniel swallowed against the knot in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to reach in to pull her out to end this surreal tableau. But he knew enough about fear to recognize its fragility. A hand too sudden, a tone too sharp, and she might shatter. So he waited. He let Shadow do what Daniel himself could not. The shepherd pressed closer, his amber coat brushing the edge of the jagged opening. Slowly, cautiously, the girl's small hand uncurled from her knees. It trembled as it hovered in the air, uncertain, fragile. Then, almost imperceptibly, her fingertips touched Shadow's fur. The dog held still, eyes half closed, chest rising in a rhythm like waves against shore. The girl stroked once, then again, the tremor in her fingers easing with each pass. A sound escaped her throat, a gasp, or maybe a sob. But it carried less fear now, more release. Daniel's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing himself to remain steady, to keep his voice low. "That's Shadow," he murmured. "He's a good boy. He'll keep you safe." The girl didn't answer, but she didn't retreat either. Her hand remained in Shadow's fur, clinging to the warmth as though it was the only solid thing in her world. Minutes passed in silence, except for the fire's crackle and Shadow's steady breathing. Finally, Daniel dared to ask, "What's your name?" She hesitated. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft it barely carried beyond the wooden planks. "Elira." The name trembled through the air like a fragile bell. Daniel nodded slowly, reverently, as though the act of hearing it was sacred. "Elira," he repeated, tasting the syllables. "That's beautiful." Her lips pressed together, uncertain whether to believe him. "Where are your parents?" "Elira." The question slipped out before he could stop it, and instantly he regretted it. He saw the way her face collapsed, the way her body tightened as though he had pressed against a wound not yet scarred. "They're—" Her voice fractured, words breaking like glass. "They're gone." The two syllables clung to the air, final, devastating. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. He had spoken those same words once over and over to doctors, to police, to himself. "They're gone." And every time the phrase carved deeper into him. Hearing them from her lips was like hearing his own grief echoed back. She lifted her eyes to him, and in them he saw not only fear but recognition. The recognition of someone else, marked by loss. "I live with my grandmother," she whispered after a long silence. "Margaret." The name seemed to cost her, as though speaking it might summon the frailty she feared. "But I don't—" She faltered, clutching Shadow's fur tighter. "I don't like being around people. It hurts." Daniel's chest tightened. He understood too well. The markets, the voices, the laughter of families, it had all been unbearable to him. Two reminders of what he'd lost. For her, the world outside must have been even harsher, sharper. "So you hide," he said softly. Not as judgment, but as recognition. Elira nodded against her knees. Walls don't laugh at you." The words pierced him. He saw the wall differently now. Not just wood, but a sanctuary she had built against the world the same way he had built walls of silence inside himself. Daniel glanced at the jagged hole at the planks scattered across the floor. He felt as though he had intruded on something sacred, exposed a wound she had carefully hidden. But Shadow's tail thumped softly, as if to remind him that wounds hidden too long could never heal. He crouched lower, lowering his face to her level. "Elira," he said gently, "you don't have to hide anymore. Not here." Her eyes searched his doubtful weary, but Shadow pressed closer, tongue brushing her knuckles in a clumsy lick. She gasped, startled, and then against all odds a tiny laugh slipped free. It was so brief, so fragile, Daniel might have missed it, if not for the way his own chest ached at the sound. He offered his hand, not reaching in, just resting it palm up on the floor. "Will you come out?" Elira's gaze darted from his hand to his face, then back to Shadow. Her breathing quickened, and for a moment Daniel feared she would vanish back into the hollow. But then her fingers slid away from the dog's fur and into his open palm, light as air, trembling, but real. Daniel exhaled a sound half relief, half prayer. Carefully, slowly, he guided her out. She resisted at first, her body rigid with fear, but Shadow circled around, nudging her legs with gentle persistence until she yielded. When she finally emerged, Daniel saw her fully clothed, too thin for the season, skin pale, as if starved of sunlight, eyes wide and red-rimmed. She stood before him like a ghost, conjured into flesh. "You're safe now," he said again, more firmly this time. He wrapped his jacket around her frail shoulders. She shivered not from cold alone, but from the overwhelming strangeness of standing outside her sanctuary. Shadow pressed close on her other side shoulder, brushing her hip, anchoring her to the world. She buried her fingers in his fur again, drawing strength from his warmth. Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The wall she had hidden behind was more than timber, it was fear, memory, trauma. Tearing down the wood had been easy compared to the work that lay ahead. But as he watched Elira lean into Shadow's side eyes, flickering with the faintest spark of trust, he felt something stir in him too. For years his life had been nothing but survival each day, endured rather than lived. Now here in the dim light of his cabin, with dust still hanging in the air and a child clinging to his dog, he felt the possibility of something else. Not healing, not yet, but the first fragile step toward it. He met Elira's gaze again. "We'll figure this out," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whether he was promising her or himself. "You don't have to be alone." Shadow wagged his tail once, a solid thump against the floor, sealing the vow with the certainty only a dog could carry. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt the wall inside his chest shift, cracks forming, light pressing through. The cabin was quiet long after Elira had stepped out of the wall. Daniel had wrapped her in his jacket, placed her near the fire, and given her a glass of warm milk from the kitchen. She sat with her knees tucked against her chest, eyes darting at every creak of the timbers, every flicker of the flames. Shadow lay stretched between them, head resting on his paws, his tail occasionally swishing when the silence grew too heavy. To Daniel, it felt as if the dog had deliberately positioned himself as a living barrier, not to keep them apart, but to connect them like a bridge of warmth, running from one wounded soul to the other. For a long while, neither spoke. Daniel sat with his hands clasped, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire as if answers might be written in the embers. Yet behind his eyes lurked images that burned brighter than the flames. The wet road glistening under headlights, the shriek of tires, the twisted wreckage that had ended everything. The nightmares always began the same way. He would be driving again, his wife humming softly beside him, his daughter in the back seat with her dolls. A light in the distance, bright, growing. Then the sound, a scream of metal on metal, and the world would tilt. He would reach, always reach, but the seat beside him would already be empty, the laughter silenced. He would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, his hands clenching air that would never hold them again. Tonight, even sitting awake, the visions pressed at him. He pressed a fist to his mouth to keep from trembling. Across the hearth, Elira hugged her knees tighter. She had been watching him, though she quickly averted her gaze when he noticed. There was a silence in her posture, too. A silence heavy with things unsaid. "You've been hiding in that wall for a while, haven't you?" Daniel asked softly. Elira's chin dipped in a reluctant nod. "Why?" Her lips parted, then closed. She tried again, her voice nearly swallowed by the crackle of wood. "Because school hurts." Daniel tilted his head, waiting. She stared into the fire, voice trembling as she continued. "When I go, everyone stares. They whisper, some laugh. They don't say it out loud, but I know they're thinking. She's the girl whose parents died." The words lodged in her throat. Her small shoulders shook, but she forced the confession through tears. "I don't want them to look at me. I don't want anyone to see me at all." Daniel's breath caught. He knew that feeling. He had walked through town once, months after the accident, and felt every eye follow him. They hadn't meant harm, perhaps, but pity could be sharper than cruelty. He had stopped going after that. He had built his life on avoiding those gazes, those reminders. "You think if you stay behind a wall, they can't touch you?" He murmured, half to her, half to himself. She nodded, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. Daniel rubbed a hand over his jaw, the stubble rasping under his fingers. "I know what that's like," he admitted. "Losing someone, then living inside a cage of your own making. I've done the same." Her eyes flicked up, a cautious searching. "You..." He hesitated, then gave a weary nod. "My wife, my little girl. A car accident. Years ago." The words felt jagged, raw, though time had dulled their edges just enough to speak them. "Since then, I haven't wanted to see anyone. Haven't wanted anyone to see me." Elira studied him, as though the revelation cracked a mirror she had believed only reflected her own pain. "So, you hide too?" "Yes," Daniel whispered. "I hide too." The admission sat heavy in the room. Yet, in its weight, there was also relief. For the first time, Daniel felt that his pain wasn't bouncing off empty walls, but was heard mirrored. And Elira, for the first time, realized her solitude was not hers alone. Shadow lifted his head then, as if to punctuate the moment. His amber eyes moved from Daniel to Elira, calm and steady, carrying a message neither of them could speak. "You are not alone anymore." Daniel reached to scratch behind the dog's ears. Elira's hand, hesitant at first, joined his, their fingers brushing lightly as they both stroked the shepherd's thick coat. The warmth of Shadow's body seeped into their hands, into the cold hollows of their chests. Elira broke the silence, her voice so soft it was almost part of the fire's whisper. "I dream about them sometimes. My parents." Daniel's throat tightened. "What do you dream? That they're still here? That I wake up and that they're making breakfast and I go to school and nobody looks at me strange? Then I really wake up and it's just me and Grandma. And Grandma's sick and..." Her voice faltered. Tears welled. "And I just don't want to be anywhere." Daniel's hand closed into a fist on his knee. He remembered the same mornings waking to the cruel trick of dreams. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what that feels like." Elira turned her face to him, her small features twisted in confusion and grief. "Then how do you live with it?" The question struck like a blow. He wanted to answer. He wanted to tell her there was a way. But the truth was raw. He hadn't lived with it. He had survived it day by shutting doors and pulling curtains, by building walls of silence. He looked at her, this child who had found the same hiding place in timber that he had built in his heart, and realized how much of himself he saw in her. "I don't know," he admitted at last. "But maybe we can figure it out together." Elira blinked at him, surprised, uncertain. Then slowly she leaned down, resting her cheek against Shadow's back. The dog sighed contentedly, tail thumping once against the rug. Daniel felt something shift inside him, then not a crumbling of the wall, not yet but a hairline crack where light might one day seep through. For the rest of the night they spoke little, but the silence was different. It was not the silence of isolation, but the silence of two people sitting on the same side of the wall, even if they hadn't yet stepped beyond it. Shadow dozed between them, the living embodiment of a bridge neither had dared cross before. And as the fire burned low, Daniel realized the shadows in their minds had not vanished, but perhaps, just perhaps, they had grown a little less dark. Daniel led Elira down the narrow hallway with slow, measured steps, his hand hovering at her shoulder, but never quite touching. She moved like a stray fawn brought into shelter, tense and ready to bolt, her eyes darting to every corner of the unfamiliar cabin. Shadow padded beside her tail, swaying gently, a calm rhythm to soften the sharp edges of her fear. At the end of the hall stood a door Daniel had kept closed for years. He paused, staring at the brass knob dulled by dust. The room beyond had been meant for his daughter, the one who would never run across its floorboards. For too long he had left it shut, unable to cross its threshold. But now, standing with Elira's fragile figure at his side, he turned the knob. The hinges groaned softly as the door swung inward. The room smelled faintly of cedar, the scent of old wood preserved in silence. A wide window stretched across the wall, opposite the door, framed by curtains he had once chosen for their bright, cheerful color, but had since faded into something quieter. Beyond the glass, moonlight pooled over the trees and painted the room silver. Daniel cleared his throat, forcing steadiness. "You can sleep here tonight." Elira lingered in the doorway, eyes sweeping the room with caution, as though it might collapse under her weight. "It's big," she whispered. He gave a small shrug. "Plenty of space to breathe." Shadow stepped past them and leapt onto the rug by the window, circling twice before settling down. His presence seemed to break the spell of hesitation. Elira shuffled forward, clutching the edges of his jacket still wrapped around her shoulders. Daniel set a spare blanket on the bed, smoothing the folds with care he hadn't shown in years. "It's warmer by the window when the sun rises," he explained, though his voice caught faintly at the memory of a little girl who had once asked for the bed near the light. Elira glanced at him, uncertain, then nodded. She climbed onto the mattress, slowly pulling the blanket up to her chin, her wide eyes never leaving Shadow's relaxed form by the window. Daniel lingered by the door longer than he meant to, watching her. She looked impossibly small against the expanse of the bed, her body curled like she was still hiding in the wall. For a moment, he felt the urge to say something reassuring, something to stitch her fractured world together. But words had always been clumsy in his mouth, so he simply said, "Good night," and closed the door halfway, leaving a sliver of hallway light to chase away the dark. Dawn came softly. Golden light spilled through the wide window, sliding across the floorboards, painting the room in hues of honey and warmth. The forest outside stirred with birdsong, faint but insistent. Elira stirred beneath the blanket lashes, fluttering against her cheeks. For a moment she tensed, heart quickening as she remembered she wasn't hidden in her wooden sanctuary anymore. But then she felt something warm and solid across her legs. She blinked. Shadow lay stretched at the foot of her bed, head resting gently across her shins. His breath rose and fell in slow rhythm, his body heavy and warm against hers, a weight that anchored her to this world. She reached down timidly at first and brushed her fingers through the thick fur along his neck. He didn't stir, only exhaled softly as though to say, You're safe." A quiet warmth bloomed in her chest. Strange, unfamiliar, but undeniably real. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elira's first thought upon waking was not fear. It was peace. The door creaked. Daniel stepped in carrying a small tray. His hair was tousled from a restless night, his eyes shadowed, but he held himself with a steadiness born of decision. "You're awake," he said, voice low. Elira sat up quickly, pulling the blanket around her. Shadow lifted his head with a grunt, then settled again. Daniel set the tray on the bedside table. "Milk," he said simply. "Still warm?" Steam curled from the ceramic cup. Elira stared at it as though it were a treasure too precious to touch. Her lips parted, then closed again. Finally, she reached out with trembling hands and drew the cup close. She sipped. The heat spread through her chest, reaching places long cold. Tears stung unexpectedly at her eyes. She wiped at them, quickly embarrassed. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He only sat on the chair near the window, watching the forest outside come alive with morning light. After a while, he murmured, "When my daughter was your age, she used to drink warm milk in the mornings. Said it made the day feel softer." Elira's fingers tightened around the cup. She glanced at him hesitant. "What was her name?" He hesitated, throat tightening around the word. Anna. The name drifted into the room like a long forbidden song. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. Elira set the cup down, pulling the blanket tighter. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to be. It's not your burden." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But I think she would have liked you." Elira blinked, startled. "Why?" "Because you're brave," he said simply. She frowned. "I'm not brave. I hide." His gaze softened. "Sometimes surviving is the bravest thing you can do." The words lingered between them, filling the space with something fragile yet strong. Elira's lips quivered as if she wanted to respond but couldn't find the language. So instead she reached down again, burying her fingers in Shadow's fur. The dog wagged his tail faintly, eyes closing, content to be the bridge neither human could yet cross. The day unfolded gently. Daniel busied himself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, fixing bread, keeping his hands moving as though motion could keep the shadows of memory at bay. Elira hovered near Shadow, exploring the edges of the room, but never straying far from the dog's side. And once Daniel caught her tracing her fingers along the window pane, watching the sunlight gild her skin. She seemed both mesmerized and wary, as if unsure whether the light would hold her or burn her. "It's different from the wall," she murmured when she noticed him watching. "What is—" She gestured at the window. "Here I can see out. The wall kept me hidden, but it also kept the world hidden from me." Daniel leaned against the doorframe. "And which do you prefer?" Elira hesitated, then looked back at Shadow, who thumped his tail in encouragement. This one, she admitted softly. The window. Something in Daniel's chest loosened. The wall had been her prison. The window might be her first glimpse of freedom. And perhaps he thought it could be his too. That evening, as twilight painted the forest in indigo, Daniel prepared another cup of warm milk. He carried it to the living room, where Elira sat cross-legged on the rug, Shadow sprawled protectively beside her. "Here," he said, handing her the cup. She took it carefully, meeting his eyes just long enough for gratitude to flicker across her face. "Thank you." The words were small, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire, but they pierced him more deeply than any shout. No one had thanked him in years. He hadn't done anything worth thanks, or so he had believed. Yet here was a child fragile and trembling, finding comfort in the simplest of gestures. As she drank, Daniel sat across from her, Shadow's steady gaze resting on them both. In that quiet circle of light and warmth, he felt something stir that had long been dormant connection. Not the forced pleasantries of neighbors, not the empty condolences of strangers, but something real. The first thread of a bond woven not by words, but by survival, by shared shadows, by the silent understanding of two people who had both lost everything. And as night settled once more over the cabin, Daniel allowed himself the smallest of hopes that this fragile thread might one day become strong enough to pull them both out of the darkness. The fire had burned low, its glow no longer fierce, but steady, like a heart beating in sleep. Outside, the night pressed against the cabin windows, thick with silence. Daniel sat slouched in his chair, elbows braced on his knees, eyes fixed on the embers as though they were doors to another time. Elira curled on the rug nearby, knees hugged close. Shadow stretched protectively along her side. The dog's slow breathing filled the pauses between the creaks of the cabin. Every so often his tail tapped against the floor as if reminding the two humans that life still pulsed here, that warmth could be shared if only they reached for it. The silence between Daniel and Elira was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of two souls circling the same grief, uncertain how to approach without collapsing under its weight. Finally, Daniel spoke. His voice was rough, reluctant. "Do you want to know why I live out here?" Elira lifted her head, her small face lit faintly by firelight. She didn't answer, only waited. Daniel drew in a breath that tasted of ash and memory. "Because once I tried living in the world, and the world reminded me too much of what I lost." He rubbed a hand over his face, fingers pressing hard at his temples. "My wife, my little girl, both gone in the space of one night." Elira's lips parted slightly, but she stayed silent. Daniel's gaze fell to the floor, his words dragging out like stones. It was raining. We were driving home from visiting her parents. The road curve the other car didn't slow. I remember the sound, the tires screaming, the shattering glass. And then, silence. Too much silence. His hands shook. I crawled out bleeding, and the only thing I could do was call their names, over and over. But they never answered. His voice faltered. He bowed his head, eyes burning. I still hear it at night. The crash. Their voices fading. I dream I can reach them, but I always wake with empty hands. The fire cracked, scattering sparks that rose and vanished. For a long time, Daniel could not look at Elira, afraid of what reflection he might find in her eyes. But then her small voice broke the silence. "I know that silence." He looked up. She had pulled her blanket tighter, but her gaze did not waver. "When the police came to tell me, when they said my parents were gone, it was like the whole world went quiet. Even my grandma's crying. It was like sound stopped existing." Daniel's breath caught. Elira's eyes shimmered, her voice trembling as she went on. "Before that, we used to play music in the kitchen. My dad would lift me and spin me until I laughed so hard I couldn't breathe. My mom would sing while she cooked. It was noisy, so noisy. But the good kind. I thought it would always be like that." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Now I can't remember the sound of their voices unless I dream. And I'm scared one day I'll forget even in my dreams." The confession hung in the air, fragile as glass. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees again, but this time to steady himself. His heart ached at her words, the same ache he had buried beneath layers of silence for years. "I know that fear," he admitted. "I forget sometimes. Their laughter, the exact color of her hair in the sun, my daughter's voice when she called me Daddy. It slips little by little, no matter how hard I try to hold it. Elira wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve. Does it mean we didn't love them enough? If we forget no. Daniel's voice was firm for the first time that night. He shook his head. It means time is cruel. But love doesn't fade just because memory does. Love stays even in the cracks. Shadow lifted his head, then shifting closer so his broad back pressed against both of them. Daniel's rough hand slid onto the dog's fur fingers, burying in the thick sable. Hesitant Elira's smaller hand joined his, resting just inches away. For a moment, they both froze, aware of the closeness. Then Daniel let his hand relax, and Elira let hers remain. Their hands, one weathered and scarred, the other small and fragile, rested side by side on the warm rise of Shadow's back. The shepherd lay still, eyes half-closed, tail swishing once, as though he knew exactly what role he played. He was the bridge, the silent ground, where two broken souls could stand without fear of falling. Daniel glanced at Elira. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, but in her eyes he saw something achingly familiar, the reflection of his own grief. Not identical, but shared. And in that recognition, something shifted inside him. We carry the same wound, he said softly. Elira nodded, her fingers curling slightly in Shadow's fur. It hurts less when someone else knows. Yes, Daniel whispered. It does. For a long while they sat like that, two survivors' hands resting on the steady warmth of a dog who asked for nothing but to be there. The fire faded to embers, the room filled with the soft hush of night, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight of his grief lift, if only slightly shared, across the fragile bond beginning to form. Elira leaned her head against Shadow's side, closing her eyes. Her breathing slowed, evening out. The exhaustion of confession of memory had finally pulled her towards sleep. Daniel watched her, the child who had hidden in his wall, who carried the same silence he knew too well. He thought of Anna, of how she might have grown, of how she might have comforted this girl, with laughter and warmth. The ache in his chest deepened, but alongside it came something else, purpose. He reached down once more, letting his hand rest on Shadow's back, near hers. We'll carry it together, he murmured, words meant for both Elira and himself. And in that quiet beneath the soft breath of a dog who had become their bridge, Daniel felt the first real crack in his wall. Not the kind that threatened collapse, but the kind that let light seep through. Morning arrived like a careful hand drawing the curtain back an inch at a time. Daniel stood at the kitchen counter with the thermos open, steam lifting in soft spirals. Out the window, a thin veil of mist lay over the trees, brightening as the sun rose, and the day felt tentative, as though it wished to ask permission before becoming itself. He glanced down the hallway toward the room, with the wide window listening for movement. A floorboard creaked. Shadow's nails ticked against the wood, then fell quiet again. He had been awake since dawn, weighing the thought that had followed him through the night. It was time to step beyond the threshold. He believed in small firsts, opening a door long closed, speaking a name aloud, warming milk. Today's first would be larger. He pictured the gentle meadow beyond the far edge of town, a low green bowl of land ringed by birches, a sliver of stream cutting silver through the grass, and wind that smelled of rye and distant rain. It was a place where sound spread and softened, where a person could breathe without the press of walls. He poured cocoa into the thermos, added a second blanket to the canvas bag, tucked in a pair of sandwiches wrapped in paper, an apple, a squeaky rubber ring Shadow adored, and a spare scarf. He touched the bag's strap, inhaled, and nodded once, as if answering an inner question. Then he walked the hallway. Elira was at the window seat, watching a jay hop along the rail of the porch. The morning light brightened her face. Shadow lay at her feet like a guard carved from warm amber, and Dusk head resting across her toes as if claiming the ground she stood on as safe. She turned at Daniel's step, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders. "Breakfast in the car?" he said gently, lifting the bag a little. "I'd like to show you something." She was still learning the landscape of his voice, where its gravel hid warmth, where its quiet wrapped reassurance. Her eyes flicked to Shadow, then back to Daniel. "Where past the town?" he said. "There's a field that catches the wind. It's open, but the edges are soft. We can sit by the stream. No crowds." Elira's fingers tightened in Shadow's fur, and the dog's ear twitched as if he had absorbed her answer before she gave it. The thought of open space made her shoulders rise toward her ears. Open meant seen. Open meant the sky high above and nothing to hold on to but air. Daniel knelt so they were level. "We'll take it slowly," he said. "You can hold Shadow's harness. If the wind feels too big, we get back in the truck and come home. The choice is yours." She studied him as if searching for a trap and finding none. She looked down at Shadow. He lifted his head, met her gaze with calm certainty, and thumped his tail against the floor twice. A signal. She exhaled. "Okay," she whispered. "If Shadow comes." "Shadow comes," Daniel said, and the shepherd's tail drew a small half-moon of approval on the rug. They stepped onto the porch together. The air held the clean bite of early light. Elira hesitated at the top step, and Daniel paused with her. He showed her the slow inhale he used on restless nights, counting softly to 4, with his fingers holding the breath for 4, letting it out for 6. She mirrored him. Shadow matched the rhythm, chest rising and falling like a bellows, a living metronome. Daniel's old truck waited beneath the birch. He opened the back door and slid the bag across the seat. Elira climbed in first and sat close to the window. Shadow leapt up and settled beside her shoulder, pressed against her hip, offering ballast. Daniel started the engine. The truck shivered, then steadied into a low hum. He took the back road that skirted town past the sawmill and the little bait shop where a wooden sign swung lazily in the breeze. Elira kept her gaze fixed beyond the glass. Trees striped the sunlight into bands of moving gold. Every time Daniel checked the mirror, she was looking at Shadow's reflection, touching the leather of his harness as if testing the reality of it. Once a cyclist passed the other way. She flinched, and Shadow leaned a fraction tighter into her legs. The flinch dissolved. "You doing all right?" Daniel asked. She nodded. "The trees are like a curtain," she said, after a moment. "It helps." "A good curtain," Daniel agreed. The road thinned to gravel. The truck bumped gently over the ruts, and laughter, small startled, escaped Elira's throat at a particularly enthusiastic bounce. Daniel's hands loosened on the wheel. It sounded different from last night's fragile sound near the wall. It carried a hint of surprise, as if a window had let in air she didn't expect to like. He parked by the fence that marked the edge of county land. Meadow opened before them, long grass tossing its 1,000 green heads. Buttercups flickering like little coins, the stream whispering as it threaded stones. A hawk drew lazy circles overhead, quiet king of a quiet country. Daniel cut the engine. With the sudden stillness, the world's quieter music reached them. Crickets water the slur of wind through birch leaves. Elira's fingers tightened again. Big sky pressed on her senses. She swallowed. Shadow's nose tested the air. Wet leaf, cool water, some far rabbit's trail, and then he looked back at her, waiting, his amber coat banded with sable, catching the sunlight like honey threaded with smoke. "Let's start here," Daniel said softly. He came around to the passenger side and opened the door. Feet on dirt, one step, then another. She slid forward. Her sneakers found the earth. Daniel offered his palm. She let her hand hover over it for a heartbeat, then chose the strap of Shadow's harness instead. The dog accepted the duty with what looked very much like pride. They stood like that girl dogman at the edge of the field, and the moment seemed to lengthen to include permission to become a beginning. The first steps were small. Elira held the leather so tightly her knuckles paled. The field offered no corners to hide in. The sky stretched without a ceiling. Fear gathered at her throat, a tightness like a fist closing. Daniel noticed her breath shorten. 5 things you can see, he said quietly, not as instruction, but as invitation. She blinked hard, looked around. Grass, yellow flowers, the stream, Shadow's ears, your hat. 4 things you can feel. Her fingers curled deeper into fur. Shadow's coat, the wind on my face, the ground under my shoes, the cup in my pocket. 3 things you can hear. She closed her eyes and listened. Water, birds, the leaves. Her breath loosened a little. Daniel smiled to himself. 2 things you can smell. She inhaled. Wet dirt, apples, from the bag. He touched the canvas strap on his shoulder. 1 thing you can taste. She wrinkled her nose, then grinned, quick and shy. Cocoa. Cocoa, he echoed, and the words seemed to please the morning. They walked farther, and the field gathered them in. Daniel laid the blanket near the stream, where birches leaned like listeners. He set the thermos and the paper-wrapped sandwiches within reach, then unclipped Shadow's leash. The dog stood still, as if deciding how to honor both freedom and duty. Daniel nodded once. Go on, he said, and Shadow burst into motion. He didn't vanish. He didn't fling himself straight for the horizon. He loped in wide, joyous arcs that traced a safe radius around them, checking in every few bounds, ears flicking to Elira's voice whenever she breathed his name. He found a tuft of grass and pounced with the self-serious enthusiasm only a shepherd can muster. Then sprang backward, sneezed indignantly as a butterfly ignored him and pretended this insult demanded a second pounce. Elira's grip loosened by inches. Her shoulders fell away from her ears. Finally, when Shadow misjudged a leap and landed in a small splash that soaked his front paws, she laughed. Real laughter, bright, clean, the sound of a window pushed fully open. It lifted and crossed the grass, startling a pair of starlings from the fence. Daniel felt it strike him like a bell. He turned his face slightly away so she wouldn't misread his expression. The laugh opened a long-locked room in him, and air rushed into it. He stood still with the sensation, understanding it without naming it. This was life nudging at their edges. Again, Elira called, and Shadow obliged, trotting to her with the rubber ring in his mouth, eyes gleaming. He offered it, chest-proud tail wagging in a patient figure 8. She reached for the toy, hesitation flickering. This was a game for children who hadn't learned to be careful of joy. She met Daniel's eyes. He nodded. She threw. The ring sailed clumsy and perfect, and Shadow streaked after it with the exact velocity required to turn small triumph into blazing reward. Good throw, Daniel said. It went crooked, she said, cheeks pinking. Crooked is more interesting, he replied, and she smiled the way people do when a new idea picks a lock in the mind. They took the morning in small handfuls. Elira learned the boundaries of the field by letting Shadow teach her here. The stream's stones grew slick and asked for slower feet. There the grass thinned and new shoots feathered the dirt. Over there a fox trail threaded between low shrubs where feathers marked last night's story. Daniel stayed a few paces behind, letting discovery be mutual rather than guided. When the sun pushed the mist away, he poured cocoa into the lid cups, handed one to Elira, and settled on the blanket. She drank, sighing, without meaning to. It tastes like indoor mornings, she said, puzzling over the contradiction. Indoor mornings in an outdoor day, he said. That's balance. She leaned against Shadow's shoulder, the dog accepting the new weight with a pleased grunt. Will people be here? She asked quietly. Later, Daniel said. A fisherman, maybe? A walker with a red jacket I've seen a few times. Folks pass along the other side of the stream, mostly. We can leave before that if you want." She nodded, considering, then looked at the sky. "It's big," she said. "But it doesn't feel like it's looking at me." He understood. "The sky has its own thoughts," he said. "We're just borrowing the light." Shadow dropped the ring in Elira's lap with a wet plop and set his chin next to it, as if to say the sky could borrow the light all it wanted. But the important business was right here, ring girl throw. She laughed again. There it was, that bell, and tossed. The shepherd tore after it, dew-spraying diamonds from his paws. A cyclist appeared on the far path, a thin black line with flashing petals. Elira's breath hitched. Her hand found Shadow's scruff before the dog had even turned back toward her. He came at once, reading the change in the wind of her body. He stood between her and the path, relaxed, but present a column of amber and sable. The cyclist passed without a glance. The ripple in Elira's breath smoothed. "Good dog," Daniel murmured. Shadow's ear flicked back. His tail tapped twice against Elira's shins. She scratched the place behind his ear that made his eyes go gentle. "He knows when I'm scared," she said. "He does?" Daniel said. "He knew before I did." "Do you get scared here?" she asked. He thought about the first time he'd come to this field after the accident, how the emptiness had echoed, how the wind had sounded like voices almost remembered. "I did," he said truthfully. "I felt exposed, as if the open ground would take something from me if I let it. Then I realized the field wasn't asking anything. It was offering space." She considered that, rolling the ring between her palms. "Space," she repeated, trying the word on her tongue, like the space between notes in a song. "Exactly," he said, surprised by the precision of her metaphor and how right it felt. They ate their sandwiches, tearing a piece for Shadow. When he sat with impeccable manners and an expression that suggested he had been starving for at least 3 days. They talked in short sentences about small things, whether the hawk's shadow made the mice hold their breath, whether buttercups always turned their faces to the sun, whether the stream sounded different if you closed one ear with a finger and tilted your head just so. Each exchange laid down another plank on a bridge neither had owned the words to ask for. After lunch, Elira dared the game of distance. She stood, kept one hand on Shadow's back, and took 3 steps away from Daniel. She stopped. The dog stood like a pillar. She took 3 more, then looked over her shoulder. Daniel raised a hand. She grinned. There it was, quick and fierce, and lifted hers. 6 steps, then 8, then back again, in a little rush, tucking herself against Shadow's side, as if to say, "I did it. Keep me steady while I notice I did it." The shepherd accepted the press of her small body, eyes half closed, weight optimized for steadiness. Daniel watched from the blanket chest, fuller than it had been in years. Each experiment rewired something in her and in him as well. He felt the old fear, the one that whispered that joy was a door that led straight to lost stir and look for ground. It found none. The present held, the field held, the dog held. They walked to the stream. Elira crouched and set her fingertips into the water. Cold ran up her arm like a wire, bringing light into a dark room. Shadow nosed the current, drank, and then, because dignity has room for foolishness, tried to bite the water that bit back. He sneezed, shook his head, and attempted to pretend he had meant to do exactly that. Elira laughed so hard she sat down, the sound of her joy tumbling along the bank like pebbles caught in the current. Daniel had not anticipated tears at a dog sneezing at a stream, yet there they were. He let them come without apology. Elira glanced up, saw his face, and her smile softened into something warmer. She didn't say anything, and he didn't explain. Shadow stood between them, water dripping from his whiskers, looking entirely satisfied with the state of the world. They lingered until the light began to lean. Shadows lengthened across the grass, and the hawks' circles widened into the blue. A breeze arrived from the west, carrying the faint scent of rain that would reach them after nightfall. Daniel packed the bag while Elira folded the blanket with the slow care of a ritual. Shadow trotted to the truck and sat by the door, certain of his next duty. "Can we come back?" Elira asked as Daniel closed the tailgate. "We can," he said, "whenever you want." She touched the fence post, as if sealing a promise with wood and grain. In the truck, she rested her forehead briefly against the cool window glass, then turned to press both hands into Shadow's coat. The dog leaned harder, and their two heads made a small, sturdy geometry of belonging. On the drive home, the air inside the cab felt different, quieter, in a way that meant something had been set down. Elira watched the trees unspool their green curtains again. She didn't count them this time. She watched the spaces between trunks as much as the trunks themselves. Daniel drove with one hand light on the wheel, the other relaxed on his knee as if the truck knew the way on its own. Back at the cabin evening, weighted with the scent of pine warmed all day, now cooling toward night. Daniel set the bag on the counter and listened to the ordinary music of home, the tick, the settling groan, the soft chuff as Shadow circled twice and lay down beside the hearth. Elira drifted to the window seat and looked out across the porch toward the trees. The sky above them was enormous still, but it seemed friendly now, like a big creature that had decided they were no threat and could be allowed to move about its garden. Daniel warmed milk. He carried 2 cups to the living room and handed one to Elira without ceremony, a continuation of a language they were learning together. She took it and curled her fingers around the heat. Today felt... She began, then trailed off, searching. "Like breathing with both lungs," he offered. She blinked, surprised into a smile. "Yes, like that." Shadow exhaled a long, contented sigh and rolled onto one hip the way dogs do when the day has fulfilled their mission so completely. There is nothing left to negotiate with time. Elira slid off the window seat and settled beside him on the rug. Daniel sat across from them, the fire painting the room with amber and gold. For a while, words were unnecessary. The field had said enough. The laughter was still in the room, invisible, but present like pollen drifting in sunbeams. Elira finished her milk and set the cup on the hearth. She looked at Daniel, hesitation flickering, then steadied. "Thank you," she said, "for the window and the field." Daniel felt something in his chest answer to those words, a small echo that had been waiting a long time. "Thank you," he said in return, and meant it. "For the laughter." She ducked her head, shy pleased. "It surprised me." "Good things often do," he said. Night gathered. He showed her the old tin of star maps Anna had adored, and they stepped outside one last time to point at the first pinpricks. Elira leaned against Shadow while Daniel traced the arc of the Big Dipper with his finger connecting dots the way they had connected small moments all day. Patient lines, gentle angles, a picture only possible because the dark allowed the light to show. When Elira finally slept, she did so with one hand resting in Shadow's ruff, her breath smooth, the lines of her face gone soft with rest. Daniel stood in the doorway, longer than needed the hall light, laying a small path of gold across the floor. He looked at them, the amber and sable guardian, the child who had laughed by the stream, and felt the bell ring again inside him, steady and clear. He closed the door most of the way and returned to the armchair. The fire burned low. The cabin's old silence was still there, but it had changed. It felt like the silence after music, holding the memory of sound. He thought of the field of Elira's laughter traveling across the grass, of Shadow's joy drawing wide circles like the hawks. He thought of tomorrow and the day after, and of how healing liked routines more than announcements. He whispered into the room to no one, and to both of them, "We'll go back." Shadow's ear flicked in his sleep as if he had heard and agreed. Outside, the wind ran its fingers through the trees and moved on. carrying with it the faintest trace of laughter, a sound that felt like a bell at the edge of town, calling two people and a dog toward whatever life would be next. The town was small, its streets a quiet network of brick and asphalt, where nothing seemed to hurry. Daniel rarely came this far except for supplies. But now, with Elira's tentative steps toward the outside world, he had decided to risk a short walk after they had driven back from the meadow. Shops lined the main street, a grocer with fruit baskets at the door, a hardware store that smelled faintly of sawdust and iron, a small bakery, releasing the sweet warmth of bread into the crisp afternoon air. Daniel carried a paper bag under one arm, Shadow healing with the calm obedience of long habit. Elira walked close on the other side of the shepherd fingers, hooked into the leather of his harness, her eyes flicking nervously to every passerby. At first, the rhythm of footsteps and shop bells seemed harmless enough. But then near the bakery, Elira froze. A girl about her age stood with two women at the corner. She wore a school backpack, her hair neatly braided. When her eyes landed on Elira, surprise widened them. Recognition sparked quick, sharp, but it was not the warm kind Elira remembered from before. Elira, the girl whispered, as if naming a ghost. Elira's breath caught. The weight of that gaze, familiar yet altered, pinned her in place. This had been a friend once, someone who had shared jump rope songs and traded stickers. But the eyes now carried distant curiosity, tinged with pity, maybe even discomfort. They were not the eyes of someone seeing her, but someone seeing the shadow of tragedy. Elira's chest constricted. Her knees weakened. The noise of the street grew louder, the scrape of chairs at the cafe, the murmur of voices, the hiss of a bus's brakes. Too much. Too close. Shadow felt it first. His body stiffened, pressing against her leg bed, tilting back to look at her with sharp concern. Daniel saw it next. He dropped the paper bag onto the hood of a parked car and crouched beside Elira. "You're all right," he said, voice steady but urgent. "Look at me. Not them. Me." But Elira's eyes were fixed on her old friend's face, on the strangeness of that stare, the chasm it had carved. Her breathing came fast, shallow, the beginning of panic. Daniel slid his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "We're leaving now," he murmured. He rose and guided her gently but firmly down the side street, Shadow circling to shield her from view. Behind them, the girl's voice carried faintly confused. That was Elira, wasn't it? But they didn't stop to hear the answer. They didn't speak until they reached the truck. Daniel opened the door, lifted the bag into the seat, then turned to Elira. Her face was pale eyes, wide and glassy, her hand still clutching Shadow's fur like it was the last rope between her and falling. "You did fine," Daniel said softly, crouching so his gaze met hers. "You stood there. You breathed. That's more than you could have done a month ago." Elira shook her head, trembling. She looked at me like I wasn't me. Like I was broken. Like a ghost. Daniel's heart clenched. People don't always know what to do with grief they haven't lived. Sometimes their eyes get it wrong. But you are still you, Elira. You're not broken. You're not a ghost. Tears welled. She buried her face against Shadow's neck. The shepherd stood perfectly still, a living wall of strength, his tail flicking in slow reassurance. Daniel stroked her hair, once awkward, but sincere. "We'll take it one step at a time. No more today. Home." Night gathered around the cabin with the hush of leaves brushing each other in the wind. Elira had retreated early to the room with the wide window. Shadow padded back and forth between her and Daniel, as if uncertain which of them needed guarding more. Daniel sat by the fire, staring at the flames, until they blurred into other shapes. He tried to will himself into sleep later, but sleep betrayed him, as it always did. The dream came sharp and merciless. Rain hammered the windshield. His wife's laughter filled the car. His daughter's voice piped from the back seat, asking if they could stop for ice cream. Then the headlights blazed, blinding violent. Screeching metal. Glass shattering. The world tilted. Anna, he screamed in the dream voice, raw. His hands reached, but the seat beside him was empty. The laughter gone. His daughter's cry cut through the air, and then silence. Terrible absolute silence. Daniel jolted awake with a shout, chest-heaving sweat cooling on his skin like ice. His hands clenched the blanket until his knuckles burned. He was shaking, caught between dream and reality, the room around him swimming in shadow. A soft sound broke through, low, insistent. Shadow's whine. The shepherd stood beside the bed, front paws pressing against the mattress. Amber eyes fixed on him with fierce attention. The dog barked once, sharp and grounding. Daniel forced his breath slower. Shadow leapt onto the bed with surprising grace for his size and pressed his weight against Daniel's side. The warmth and solidity anchored him, pulled him out of the nightmare's undertow. "I'm here," Daniel muttered, hand-finding the fur at the dog's neck. His throat ached with the truth of it. "I'm still here. Because of you." The door creaked softly. Daniel turned and found Elira in the doorway, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, bare feet peeking from beneath the hem. Her eyes were wide, but not with her own nightmare. She had heard his. "Are you okay?" she whispered. For a moment, Daniel thought to lie, to wave it away, hide behind the silence he had built for years. But then he saw her small frame, the way she held her blanket like armor. And he realized they were already past pretending. "No," he admitted hoarsely. "Not always." She crossed the room and climbed onto the edge of the bed, careful not to dislodge Shadow. The shepherd made room without moving far, his body stretched between them like the steady line connecting two frayed edges. Elira drew her knees to her chest. Her voice trembled. "Sometimes I dream too. I see my mom's face, but then it changes. It turns into strangers who stare. Or it fades until there's nothing left. I wake up so scared that one day I'll forget her." Daniel closed his eyes. "I forget pieces of them too. The exact shade of her hair in sunlight. The sound of my little girl's laugh." He pressed his hand harder into Shadow's fur. "That forgetting feels worse than the loss some nights." Elira leaned against the dog, her cheek on his back. "Does it ever stop?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not stop, but it changes shape. Some days it's sharp, other days it's dull. And once in a while, if you let it, it can even soften into something that reminds you of love instead of loss." Her eyes shimmered, reflecting the faint firelight. "That sounds impossible." He gave a weak smile. "So did walking through a field. But you did that." Her mouth curved, faintly reluctant, but real. She shifted closer, small shoulder brushing his arm. Shadow sighed deeply, head dropping onto his paws, content with his role as bridge and guardian. In the hush of the night, the cabin held them, one man haunted by memory, one child terrified of being forgotten, and one dog who carried their burdens without needing words. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of breathing, the rhythm of hearts, still beating, the presence of lives that, though fractured, were not alone. Daniel leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closing. "We'll get through the night," he murmured, words as much a vow as comfort. Elira's hand sought his in the blanket's fold. Small, tentative fingers brushed his rough knuckles. He didn't pull away. He let the contact stand, let it say what both of them needed. The fear is real, but so are we. Shadow's tail thumped once against the mattress. The night stretched on, heavy but survivable. And though the wound inside them had reopened raw and stinging, Daniel realized that perhaps it had to. Wounds could only heal in the air, not when sealed away behind walls. The road toward Margaret's house wound through low hills dotted with oak and pine. Daniel drove carefully, the truck rumbling like an old beast that knew every turn by memory. Elira sat in the back seat with Shadow's head resting heavily across her lap. Her small fingers moved rhythmically through the shepherd's fur as if the motion alone could steady the nervous fluttering of her heart. She hadn't seen her grandmother in several weeks. The thought of returning filled her with conflicting tides: comfort, fear, guilt. Margaret was the one person left who carried the weight of her parents' absence. But Margaret was also fragile now, slowed by age and illness. Elira worried that her presence, her grief, might be more burden than blessing. Daniel glanced into the rearview mirror. He caught the pale set of her face, the way she leaned unconsciously toward Shadow. "Almost there," he said softly. Elira nodded, but didn't speak. Shadow blinked at Daniel's reflection, as though reminding him to be gentle. Margaret's house sat at the edge of town, a weathered two-story cottage with faded blue shutters and a porch sagging slightly in the middle. Flowers still grew stubbornly in boxes beneath the windows, though some leaned tiredly toward the earth. The house felt like its owner, aged worn, but still clinging to beauty where it could. As Daniel parked by the gate, the front door opened. Margaret appeared, her thin frame wrapped in a cardigan, hair silver as frost. Her face lit when she saw Elira. Elira. The voice trembled, equal parts joy and disbelief. She hurried down the steps, though her movements were careful, slowed by joints that no longer obeyed. Elira slid from the truck before Daniel could open her door. She ran the short distance and folded into her grandmother's arms. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away. Margaret cradled her as if she were still a child, small enough to lift. Tears shone on both their faces. "My darling girl," Margaret whispered, stroking her hair. "I've missed you so much." Elira clung tighter, whispering into the fabric of her cardigan. "I missed you too, Grandma." Shadow trotted up, tail wagging politely. Margaret smiled through her tears and reached a trembling hand to stroke his head. "And you must be the one keeping her safe." "He is," Daniel said quietly, coming forward at last. Margaret's eyes lifted to him. There was gratitude in them, but also a shadow of worry. She gave a small nod acknowledging his presence before guiding Elira up the porch steps. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Lace curtains softened the light, and framed photographs lined the mantel, smiling faces of Elira's parents, images of family gatherings that now belonged to another world. Elira's gaze lingered on one picture in particular, her mother laughing at something off-camera, eyes bright. She reached for it unconsciously, but stopped, hand trembling, before dropping back to her side. Margaret guided her into the living room, settling her gently on the sofa. Shadow curled at Elira's feet, as if to stake his claim. Margaret lowered herself into the armchair opposite with a small sigh, as though her bones had grown heavier with every year. Daniel remained standing for a moment, then sat at the edge of the other sofa, posture formal, almost uneasy. For a while, the reunion filled the space. Margaret touched Elira's cheek, asked after her. Health marveled at how thin she had grown, how her eyes seemed older than her years. Elira answered in soft tones, never letting her hand leave Shadow's fur. Finally, Margaret looked at Daniel. Her voice was gentle, but carried the weight of unspoken questions. "You found her." "She found me," Daniel corrected. "Or perhaps Shadow did. Either way, she's been staying at my cabin these past weeks." Margaret's gaze lowered. Relief flickered across her features, but behind it was another emotion, concern tinged with guilt. She clasped her frail hands together. "I worried. I couldn't give her what she needed anymore. My body doesn't listen the way it used to. The doctor says my heart is not strong. I try, but..." She shook her head. "I fear I'm failing her." Elira leaned forward quickly, alarmed. No, Grandma. You're not failing. You're the only one who stayed. Margaret's smile was tender, but sorrowful. Staying is not always enough, my love. Her eyes moved again to Daniel, studying him. But she looks less lost than when I last held her. That, I think, is your doing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. She's strong on her own. I've done very little. Perhaps Margaret allowed, but sometimes very little is exactly what is needed. A safe place. A hand not demanding, but willing. That is no small gift. Daniel looked away, throat tight. He did not feel like a gift. He felt like a man stumbling through darkness, barely holding himself together. But Margaret's words carried a quiet conviction that unsettled him. Later, when Elira went upstairs to fetch a book she had left behind months earlier, Margaret leaned closer to Daniel. Her voice dropped, weighted with urgency. "I'm grateful to you," she said. "More than I can say. But you must understand my health is failing. I cannot keep up with her needs, not when she's carrying wounds too heavy for a child. She needs someone steady." Daniel froze. "I'm not steady," he said bluntly. "I wake screaming half the nights. I hide from the world as much as she does." Margaret studied him with clear, unwavering eyes. "And yet, you are here. You sit with her in the silence. You listen to what others might dismiss. That is steadiness of another kind." His jaw tightened. "You think I can give her what you cannot." "I think," Margaret replied, voice trembling slightly, "that she has already chosen you. Watch her eyes when she looks at you. She leans toward Shadow, yes, but when she seeks safety with a person, she looks to you." Daniel had no answer. He felt the truth of it, but feared what it implied. To let someone lean on him was to risk failing them again. Margaret reached across the small table, her hand frail but steady as it touched his. "Don't turn away, Daniel. You've both lost so much. Perhaps together you can keep each other from losing more." His throat tightened. He looked away, blinking hard. Shadow raised his head from the floor, watching him, as if adding his own silent weight to Margaret's words. Elira returned, clutching the worn spine of a children's book. She curled up beside her grandmother, resting her head against Margaret's shoulder. For a few moments, it felt like the old world had returned before loss, before silence. They spent the evening together, simple and slow. Margaret made tea, though her hands shook pouring it. Elira read aloud a few pages from her book, her voice tentative, but growing steadier with each sentence. Daniel listened the cadence of her words, stirring a memory of bedtime stories told to his daughter long ago. When night approached, Margaret guided Elira upstairs toward her old room. But at the doorway, Elira paused. Shadow had followed her faithfully, pressing close to her side. She knelt, wrapping her arms around his neck, whispering something into his fur that made him sigh deeply in response. Then she turned, eyes wide and uncertain, and looked at Daniel. Her voice was small, almost inaudible. "I want to stay with you a little longer," she whispered. "With you and Shadow." The word struck Daniel like a blow and a blessing both. His chest tightened, caught between fear and something dangerously close to hope. He glanced at Margaret. The old woman's eyes glistened. She nodded slowly, though her lips trembled. "If that is what you wish, child, and if Daniel will allow it." Daniel's breath caught. The choice pressed heavy on him, heavier than anything in years. But Elira's gaze, fragile and pleading, left little room for retreat. He swallowed hard. "Of course," he said softly. "As long as you need." Elira's face lit with quiet relief. She pressed her cheek once more to Shadow's fur, whispering again the words she had only just found the courage to speak aloud. "I feel safe." Shadow wagged his tail once, slow and sure. Margaret's eyes closed briefly, as if in prayer. Daniel stood frozen, heart pounding, realizing that in the space of a few words, his world had shifted again. That night, as they prepared to leave, Margaret stood on the porch, leaning heavily on the railing. The porch light haloed her silver hair, and her smile trembled, but did not falter. "Take care of each other," she said, voice carrying into the night. Daniel nodded once, unable to answer with words. Elira hugged her grandmother tightly, then returned to Shadow's side. Together, they climbed into the truck. As the engine rumbled to life and the house shrank in the rearview mirror, Daniel felt Margaret's trust settle like a weight across his shoulders. It was not a burden he had asked for, but it was one he could no longer ignore. Elira leaned against Shadow, eyes heavy with sleep, lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter, the road unfolding into darkness ahead. For the first time in years, he did not feel entirely alone with his ghosts. He felt entrusted. He felt responsible. And though he feared the cost, he felt needed. The decision arrived at breakfast, simple as setting a mug on the table. Daniel stood at the counter with a pencil behind his ear, a list on the back of an old envelope, and the shape of a plan taking form with the steadiness of breath. Outside, a pale winter sun pressed through thin cloud, sketching the window frame onto the kitchen floor in a rectangle of light. Elira sat at the table with Shadow draped along her feet like a living rug, her fingers combing his ruff in absent circles. She watched Daniel's face as if reading weather there. "I'm going to fix that room," he said, not looking up yet. "The one with the old paneling. It's soft in places. Rot. I should have done it years ago." Elira's hand stilled in Shadow's fur. The wall, she murmured the words, arriving like a memory being named. He looked over then and caught the way her shoulders drew in, the way her eyes pulled toward the hall and back to him. She swallowed. "Can I help? You can," he said, surprised by how natural the answer felt. "But we'll do it safely. Goggles? Gloves? I'll talk you through the tools. We'll turn off the power before we touch anything that might have wires behind it." Shadow lifted his head at the word, help, ears pricking, tail thumping once under the table, a vote, a blessing, a declaration of availability. They drove into town for supplies, fresh masks, a pry bar with a narrow bite contractor bags, a short-handled sledge, a stud finder with a little chirp, a box of screws for the new trim that would come later. At the hardware store, Daniel let Elira pick the color of their gloves from a wire bin near the register. She turned over options with unusual deliberation and settled on a pair with a thin green band around the cuffs, the exact green of the meadow's spring shoots. On the way out, Shadow paused at the automatic door and looked up as it breathed open like a gentle creature. His tail tilted in polite acknowledgement, and Elira laughed softly. The sound folded itself into Daniel's pocket with the receipts. Back at the cabin, Daniel killed the breaker feeding that side of the house and taped a red note over the panel. "Off, do not turn on." He walked Elira through the plan, while Shadow performed his own inspection, nose busy at baseboards, snorting dust out of corners like a small, self-appointed foreman. "We'll start by scoring the paint along the trim edges," Daniel said, handing Elira a utility knife and showing her how to keep the blade shallow. That way we don't tear it up when we pry. He demonstrated on a short length, his hand steady, then guided hers over the next. She took the motion carefully, tongue caught between her teeth. Precision in a child who had learned to live between sharp edges. The panels were the thin varnished kind, popular when the house was younger, pretending to be something stronger, carrying a sheen that turned cheap under close scrutiny. Daniel slid the flat bar under the first seam and eased. The panel lifted with a sticky sigh. Beneath the cavity exhaled a breath of cold old air, damp and mineral, a scent like closed attics and forgotten trunks. Shadow sneezed. Elira giggled, then coughed at a bloom of dust, then giggled again, the sound stuttering but resilient. They worked in a rhythm score pry-ease bag. Daniel kept a steady commentary. Listen for the nail squeak, that's the head coming through. Mind your wrist, small pushes, not big ones. Good like that. Elira matched him, notch by notch, the tightness in her shoulders loosening as muscle began to remember rather than anticipate. Each little complaint of metal against wood, each thock of the bar against a hidden nail was a punctuation mark, in a new language once spoken by hands and translated into breath. Shadow made it his job to escort every loose panel to a contractor bag. He took small shards in his mouth, with theatrical delicacy stepping high through the dust as if the floor had turned to tide pools. When Daniel caught his eye with a mock stern look, "That's not for you," Shadow merely adjusted his grip until he was carrying a worthless wedge and wagged his tail to show compliance. He placed each piece by the open bag and looked back proudly for instruction. Elira appointed him assistant to the assistant, with great seriousness. He preened. They found old things. A yellow marble rolled out and went singing across the floor until Shadow stopped it with one paw and looked ashamed as if he'd wounded it. A postcard from 1978, sun-faded, addressed to a dear Mrs. Harlan. Weather is fine, the lake is colder than I remember. A bobby pin rusted into a punctuation of itself. They found too what rot looks like when it colonizes quietly in the dark, a patch where the paneling blistered and gave, under a thumb where the back of the board had turned the color of old tea and smelled faintly sweet in the way some things do before they become ruin. Daniel cut away these sections into careful squares and wrapped them, bagging them as if bagging small unspoken sorrows. Mid-morning, Elira's swings with the hammer began to lengthen. Not wild, never wild, but sure. When a stubborn nail refused the pry bar, Daniel showed her how to set the claw under its head and pull with the strength of her legs, not just her arms. She followed, and the nail came with a soft cry. She held it up in triumph, a small crooked letter she'd unhooked from a sentence that no longer served. "Feels like knocking on a door," she said, breathing warm inside the mask, but from inside trying to get out. Daniel paused with a board balanced against his hip. The metaphor sat between them and blinked in the light, simple and enormous. "Yes," he said. "It does." They broke for sandwiches on the back steps. Shadow, spotted with dust like flour on a baker's apron, leaned his shoulder into Elira's knee and accepted his allotted crusts with monkish gravity. The sky had thinned to a bright sheet by noon, and through the kitchen window the stripped section of wall looked less like absence and more like a promise, a frame awaiting picture. "I used to think the wall kept me safe," Elira said, touching the green cuff of her glove, where the dust had made a pale map, "but it also kept the world out. I couldn't hear the stream from your field." Or Margaret's laugh when she remembered something good. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag. "You can hear them from here." "Sometimes," she said. "In my head. Better than before." He nodded, unsure whether the ache in him was sorrow or gratitude. Perhaps both. He reached into the bag, brought out 2 apples, and balanced one on Shadow's head until the dog's eyes crossed comically with effort. Elira howled. The apple slipped. Shadow snatched it mid-fall and returned it whole to Daniel's hand, smug as a magician. They applauded him like he'd invented levitation. Back in the room, Daniel ran the stud finder across the cavities and marked the lines with light pencil X's. "We'll keep these," he said, rapping a knuckle against a vertical member. "They're sound. Everything tired around them goes." Elira tapped the stud and listened. "Like bones," she said. "The strong parts." He nodded. "Like bones." They came to the section that had once hidden Elira. They both slowed without meaning to. The panel's varnish seemed slightly darker there, as if Scar remembered where skin had once been cut. Daniel set the pry bar aside and laid his palm flat. The wood was cooler than the air. He looked at Elira. She had gone very still, gaze turned inward, hands folded. Shadow stepped between them and pressed his nose against the seam with ritual solemnity. "We don't have to do this part today," Daniel said. Elira shook her head. "I want to." She turned toward him, eyes lucid. "I want it gone." He showed her how to score along the seams, his voice lower, almost reverent. She set the blade and drew it straight. Shadow sat like a sentinel, ears forward. Daniel set the bar and offered the handle to her. She took it and leaned in. The panel resisted, and then gave with a soft, tired sigh like a house releasing a breath it didn't know it held. They pulled it free together. Behind it, the bare studs, the rough backside of the exterior, cladding some drifts of old insulation, turned the color of stale straw. The cavity that had once been a child's hiding place now looked as all cavities do when you're no longer inside them, smaller than memory, more ordinary than myth, but carrying a gravity that was not optical. Elira reached out and touched the inside of the stud where her shoulder might once have pressed. She left a clean fingerprint on the dusty wood. She lifted it to the light and studied the whirl with faint wonder, as if recognizing herself in bark. Daniel cleared his throat. "Do you want to?" "I don't know." "Leave a mark. Something that says you were here and now you're not," she thought, then nodded. He fetched a pencil from behind his ear and offered it. She didn't write a name. She drew a window, 4 panes, simple lines, a rectangle of possibility. Under it, very small, she wrote one word: out. Daniel swallowed. "That's perfect," he said. "Your turn," she said, handing him the pencil. He stared at the pale wood as if it might ask him a question about honesty. Then he printed a single word above her window. Slow, so his hand wouldn't shake. Through. They stood back and looked at the 2 words, one above the other. Through. Out. Shadow tipped his head as if the caption pleased him. The afternoon deepened. They worked in long, unhurried swaths. With each section down, light traveled farther into the room, bouncing off floorboards and the glass of picture frames stacked against the wall. Dust hung in it like constellations. The work asked enough of their bodies that their minds had less space to replay familiar terrors. The hammer's weight in Daniel's hand felt good, honest, exact. Elira began to anticipate where the panel would crack and where it would peel in a long, clean sheet. Her sentences shortened, then disappeared. She found something like meditation in the repetition. Every so often, Daniel's breath hitched memory, crossing its old bridge to that thin place where dream flares in daylight. Each time, Shadow paused his patrol and leaned hip to knee, grounding him like ballast. Sometimes the shepherd took a strip of scrap and trotted laps with it, too proud to admit it was heavy. Sometimes he pawed a nail toward Daniel like a bowling champion presenting a trophy, then looked intensely pleased with his own contribution to OSHA compliance. They saved the largest expanse for last. When the final lengths came down, they revealed a surprise, not rot, not ruin, but a window that someone had boarded over decades ago, trim still in place, glass clouded with age, but whole. Daniel laughed aloud, startled by joy. "You've been here hiding?" he said to it with the same tone he had used when he first spoke to Elira through the wall. Elira pressed her palms to the dusty panes and peered through. Outside, the birches made pale bars across the yard, and beyond them, the line of the stream caught a thread of sky and wore it like silk. She stepped back, eyes bright. "Can we open it? We can try," Daniel said. "The sash is painted shut, but the hardware's brass. It might be sound." They scraped the paint elbows to window, softening it with patience. Daniel ran a putty knife along the seam, prying each layer of old color out of the joint. When the paint at last surrendered its grip, the lower sash budged a fraction. He wiggled it gently. Elira braced the frame and pulled, breath held. The window rose like a stiff arm remembering its arc. Air came in cold and clean and alive lemons in a winter room. It wrapped round their bodies and waited for them to notice. Shadow stuck his snout into the new square inhaled, then sneezed theatrically as if baptizing the opening. He wagged so hard his back end suggested a separate dog. Outside light poured in free of varnish and pretense. It climbed the far wall and laid a pale hand over the floor where Elira had sometimes sat to tie her shoes with one ear toward the world. In it, the motes whirled like seeds looking for soil. Daniel closed his eyes and let the warmth press against his eyelids. He could almost see the field through skin. They didn't speak for a long time. There wasn't language for what grew in the quiet. The room wasn't finished studs, bare edges, ragged scraps to bag and haul, but it had tipped. It had become a place where future could sit down. When words did return, they came from Elira, very soft. I thought taking it down would make me feel exposed. Like I'd be smaller without it. She touched the window sash. But I feel bigger. Daniel leaned his shoulder to the frame, the paint cool through his shirt. It feels like that to me too, he said. It's strange. I built my inside wall to keep the world out. It kept the worst out. But it kept the best out too. I forgot there was a difference. Shadow, receiving no immediate assignment, solved the problem by picking up a long, useless strip and parading it like a pennant. He tried to take it through the doorway, lengthwise discovered geometry and stood there thinking about it with an expression of deep philosophy, until Elira laughed and turned it 90 degrees for him. He pranced into the hall like a victorious engineer. They swept, they bagged. They stacked the salvageable trim in a neat pile for later. The sun slid along the floor and rose up the opposite wall until the room held a mellow late-afternoon gold. Dust turned to glitter. Their masks came off. The scent of old wood gave way to pine from the yard. Somewhere in the distance a hawk called once and let the air answer. "Come here," Daniel said finally, voice so low it almost belonged to the boards. He reached for the blank wall that still wore its paint and placed the heel of his hand against it. Elira mirrored him on the adjacent stud, and Shadow, not to be left out, pressed his shoulder between theirs. They stood like that. A human palm, a child's fingertips, a dog's warm weight touching what remained and what had gone. Daniel cleared his throat. "We'll rebuild," he said. "Not the way it was, with light. With a window that opens when we want it to. With shelves for the books you brought back from Margaret's. With a chair under this window for mornings that need soft starts. And a hook for Shadow's leash." Elira added earnest as a city planner. "So he knows where it is," and that Daniel said. Elira looked at the studs again, the penciled through and out, her little window drawing, then at the real window, open a good 3 inches, now letting the world practice coming in. "Can it stay like this for a day?" "Before we put new boards, it can," Daniel said. It should. He imagined waking in the night and seeing a square of sky framed by work and choice rather than accident. He imagined morning opening in a room that had decided to be honest. They carried the last heavy bag out to the truck bed together. Shadow hopped up and sniffed them one by one, as if checking for structural defects, then declared them sound, with a lick to each wrist. Inside again, Daniel leaned the broom against the wall and looked at what they had done. His chest felt tired and proud in equal measure. He looked at Elira, the green cuff of her glove, now gray with dust, a streak of cobweb in her hair. She hadn't noticed the way her eyes kept returning to the open glass, as if gravity had shifted toward it. "Thank you," he said, surprising himself with the intensity of gratitude in his voice. She tilted her head. "For what?" "For the help," he said. "For the company. For pulling with me." Her mouth curved. "You didn't let go." He shook his head. "Not this time. They didn't so much decide to be quiet as fall into it. The room did the talking. Late light pooled at their shoes, climbed. Shadow's legs turned his coat the color of warm bread, in that slow golden pause. The three of them stood where the wall had been. One hand on wood, one hand on air, one shoulder in between, and felt a new shape of house arrange itself around their breathing. Shadow yawned extravagantly, cracked his jaw, and flopped onto his side with a groan of absolute satisfaction. Elira folded down beside him, tucking into the curve of his belly all knees and elbows, and dust and safety. Daniel sank to the floor opposite, back to the new light legs, out hands lax between his knees. They looked at one another through the bright. Words would have been smaller than the thing they shared, so they didn't use them. The window breathed. The room listened. The bare studs held their penciled vow through, out. And the day sealed it with light. A beginning quiet, as a heart steady as a dog's sleep. A wall gone, and in its place, a way forward. The park lay just beyond the town square, a stretch of green threaded with winding paths and dotted with benches where families gathered. On weekends, laughter spilled like music across the grass, children chasing one another, kites catching in the bright sky, the clatter of a ball bouncing against pavement. Daniel parked at the edge of the lot, hands still on the wheel, longer than necessary. He glanced at Elira in the passenger seat. She sat with her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the open expanse ahead. Shadow shifted in the back tail, thumping gently against the seat, as if urging them both forward. "You don't have to," Daniel said softly. Elira's hands twisted in her lap. I want to try." He nodded, pride and worry mingling in his chest. "All right, let's go." Shadow leapt out first, landing with a confident shake, ears perked toward the sound of children's voices. Daniel clipped the leash onto his collar, then handed the loop to Elira. Her fingers curled tight around it, knuckles pale, but she let herself be led forward. They walked slowly into the park. Elira's eyes darted everywhere, the swing swaying, a boy racing with a red kite, the bright cluster of children rolling a ball across the grass. Each sound seemed to ripple through her, making her grip tighten on the leash. Shadow felt it. He gave a low woof, tugging just enough to draw her closer to the open field. Daniel stayed a step behind, letting the bond between child and dog guide this part of the journey. When they reached the edge of the grass, a ball rolled toward them, bright yellow, stopping just at Shadow's paws. He nosed it lightly, sending it closer to Elira's shoes. A girl about her age came running, breathless and smiling. "Sorry. Could you pass it back?" Elira froze, every muscle taut. The girl tilted her head, waiting, patient but curious. For a long moment, Elira's gaze wavered between the ball and the expectant face. Shadow sat neatly at her side and nudged the ball again, this time, pressing it against her shoe. His tail wagged once, decisive. Elira drew a trembling breath. Her foot lifted. Slowly, she pushed the ball toward the girl. The girl caught it with a grin. "Thanks. Do you want to play?" She held the ball out, arms extended. Elira hesitated. Fear tugged at her like the wall she had once hidden behind. But Shadow's weight leaned against her leg, steady, certain. She reached out, tentative, halting, and took the ball into her hands. Something shifted in her face then. The stiffness softened. Her lips curved, small at first, then fuller. A smile, fragile, radiant, bloomed across her features. The girl beamed back. "Come on." She darted toward the group, waiting for Elira to follow. Elira stood rooted for a second, clutching the ball. Then, with a glance at Shadow and the faintest nod, she stepped forward. The shepherd trotted beside her leash, slack, his mission complete. From where he stood, Daniel watched. He saw her shoulders lift, then settle. He saw her hands relax their grip. He saw her smile return like a sunrise after too long a night. Something inside him eased. The world had given her back a piece of itself, and she had accepted it. He exhaled slowly, his eyes blurring in the brightness. He knew there would still be shadows, still be nights of fear and memory. But this single shining moment was proof that the wall was no longer unbroken. Elira laughed. The sound was light, startling, beautiful. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. When he opened them again, she was running across the grass with the other children, Shadow bounding after her, ears flying. And Daniel understood she was stepping into the light, and somehow, so was he. Life settled into a rhythm not perfect, but gentle. Elira lived with her grandmother Margaret, yet nearly every afternoon she walked the winding road to Daniel's cabin. Sometimes she carried her school books, sometimes only her laughter. But always Shadow met her at the gate with a bark of delight and a wagging tail that shook the dust from the air. Daniel found himself waiting for those footsteps. The cabin that had once been hollow with silence now carried echoes of conversation, of mugs clinking, of pages turning aloud. He no longer lived in a prison of memory. The door had been cracked open by a child and a dog, and sunlight had insisted on entering. In time, Daniel followed Elira's lead. He began stepping into the town, more often not only for supplies, but for community. He repaired a broken fence for a neighbor, carried Margaret's groceries when her hands trembled too much, and even joined a small volunteer group that cleared brush along the stream. People were surprised at first to see him, the man, once known for his distance, now offering help. Slowly their surprise turned into welcome. And always at his side was Shadow. The shepherd became a fixture in town life, a creature children trusted instantly and adults greeted with fond pats. He lay calmly beside park benches, watched over games at the schoolyard, and accompanied Daniel and Elira on every errand. To many he became more than a dog. He was a quiet emblem of loyalty and the bond that had brought two broken hearts together. Margaret, though still frail, glowed whenever she saw the change. She told Daniel more than once, with tears in her eyes, that he had given Elira back the sound of her laughter. Daniel never knew what to answer, but he carried the words with humility, letting them settle into the cracks where grief used to live. Evenings were their favorite. Often Margaret would visit the cabin walking slowly with her cane, and Daniel would guide her up the steps. Together they would sit on the porch, a quilt spread across Margaret's knees, Elira curled close with a book in hand, and Shadow stretched at their feet with his head heavy on Daniel's boot. One evening the sky caught fire with sunset gold and rose spilling across the horizon, painting the trees in warm light. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and a hush settled as if the world itself were listening. Elira leaned against her grandmother's shoulder, eyes soft with contentment. Margaret stroked her hair, murmuring something only grandmothers can say. Daniel sat beside them, silent but steady, his gaze resting on the glowing line where sky touched earth. Shadow lifted his head, surveying them with quiet authority. Then he sighed, lowered himself back down, and closed his eyes, tail sweeping once against the wood. In that stillness, something became clear. The house around them was only timber and nails, the walls strong but ordinary. What made it home was not the roof overhead, but the threads of trust, love, and healing woven between them. Daniel felt it like a steady drum in his chest, the knowledge that home was not lost with tragedy, not buried in silence. Home could be rebuilt, not with hammers alone, but with laughter, shared tears carried together, and the warmth of loyalty that never wavered. The porch creaked gently beneath their weight, the sun lowered, and shadows stretched long across the grass. Margaret's hand rested on Daniel's. Elira's head nestled deeper into her grandmother's side, and shadow lay across all their feet like a sentinel and a blessing. They did not need words. The truth was simple, luminous as the horizon. The true home was here where their hearts had found peace again.